kind of man was Tom Marshall? Let me take you back to meet him as a boy, to a late afternoon in 1932. You've come to a little house in Randwick Crescent in the working class suburb of Moira. Mrs. Isabella Marshall greets you at the door. She's a small, plump, cheerful woman. On your way in, you glimpse the front room. There's not much furniture, there's a bookcase, a lot of books. Like most Scots, this family has a high regard for books. Tom, who's 11, is reading a book in the bedroom he shares with younger brother Ernie. It's Ivanhoe by Sir Walter Scott. He's small for his age, rather awkward in the company of strangers. He'd rather be riding on horseback over the Scottish moors, fighting duels, rescuing beautiful women. No one can understand the exciting life he leads in his imagination. Mrs. Marshall shows you into the parlour. There's a black coal range with a hob for cooking. Beyond the parlour there's a narrow scullery. The youngest daughter, Anne, who's dark and pretty, is peeling potatoes. Mrs. Marshall has a broad Scots accent. At times you don't quite catch what she says. She says heed for head and hem for home. Tom and his sister Margaret were born in Dalry, she says. They came to New Zealand when Tom was 4. Ernie and Anne were born here. She tries not to show it, but she's proud of Tom. He was put forward a year at Randwick School. He gets good school reports. He loves rugby and cricket. Next year he'll start at Hutt Valley High School. They're staunch Baptists, this family. She and Mr. Marshall have been members of the Lower Hutt Baptist Church since it opened in 1929. She's got some photographs of her own family. They were born and grew up in Kilbarchan. Their father, Hugh MacDonald, was a carrier. She worked in a paper mill until she married. Here's her husband, home from work. Railway workshops in Moira. He's a slight, softly spoken man. Mr. Robert Fernie Marshall greets his guest courteously. He speaks in broad Scots, calls his wife Bella. He looks over her shoulder at the photographs on the table. There's one of him in a private's uniform, standing beside the ambulance he drove in France during the Great War. Mr. Marshall shows us his garden with quiet pride. Dahlias are doing well. The vegetable garden is a treat to see with its rows of cabbages, carrots, cauliflowers and beans. It's peaceful on this evening in 1932. No blaring radios or cars, just the faint clucking of hens from the farmhouse. As we leave, we notice Tom, still engrossed in his book. Here he is at Hutt Valley High School. He's wearing cricket whites in the photo. Most likely they were borrowed from one of the better off boys. He feels embarrassed at having to borrow sports gear, but the family budget doesn't run to it. He's doing well. He passes school certificate, matriculates the following year. He wants to go to university when he's 18, maybe become a lawyer. His mother Isabella puts her foot down because, as she says, lawyers have to tell too many lies. It's 1939. A worried-looking Tom is walking home from Woburn Station after a day at the office. He's enlisted in the Navy. He's gone and done it. Hasn't told his mum yet. Wish he didn't have to. She'll hit the roof. Why do mothers have to fuss so much? He hopes Dad will back him up. What's in store for him? Soon he'll be training in Great Britain. He's never been further away from Wellington than Palmerston North. He won't be home for 6 years. He'll serve on aircraft carriers and as a navigator in the Fleet Air Arm, end up a sub-lieutenant. While on leave, he'll look up his relatives in Scotland. He'll meet and marry a pretty wren, Jenny Byrne-Jones from Glasgow. She's Church of Scotland, not Baptist, but he's sure Mum and Dad will approve. It's 1947. Wheeling son Philip in his pram through the botanical gardens in Wellington, the proud couple are snapped by a street photographer. They live in a flat in Mary Street. Tom's working in the Treasury, studying for a Bachelor of Commerce degree. 2 years pass. A second son, Mark, is born. Tom's career prospects in Treasury look good. He's a graduate, but he's feeling dissatisfied. Maybe it's a creative side in his nature that's not being fulfilled. Jenny is desperately homesick. Her father died recently. She's missing her sisters Meg and Daphne back in Scotland. Here he is, walking to his home in Tower Flat. It's 1956 now. In his briefcase are page proofs of a parent-teacher magazine. He's the assistant editor. He has some new children's books, which he's just reviewed. Kemlo and the Space Invaders. Philip should be pleased. He enjoys writing and editing, but something's still missing. Jenny regrets he left Treasury to work for that advertising company. It's 1960. Tom is sitting in the lounge of his house in Wainuiomata. He's reading. He reads widely: history, philosophy, biography, theology, essays, fiction. Jenny and the children have been long asleep. He goes to the kitchen to make a cup of tea. He lights a cigarette. Problems. If he's honest, there are big problems in his life. Problems with his job, problems with money, problems with the kids, problems with his parents, problems with the church. His strategy for handling problems is to put them out of mind, not think about them. That causes problems with Jenny because she'd rather face things head on. Sighing, he returns to his book. Jenny appears at the door. Tom, it's nearly 1 o'clock. He closes the book. In bed, Jenny says to him, don't forget we're going to the meeting tomorrow. Meeting? It's some charismatic preacher Jenny wants him to hear. He doesn't fancy going. Maybe he'll miss his normal train home. Be too late then. Think about it in the morning. You cannot guess what lies ahead for you, Tom, at this still point in time, this evening in 1960. You have big changes ahead in career and family circumstances. There'll be many obstacles to overcome, crises tougher than anything you've ever faced before. It won't be easy or comfortable. You'll make mistakes, but you'll discover what true integrity of character is. There's a lot of work to be done, Tom. A church to be built, hundreds of sermons to be preached, thousands of people to be counseled, encouraged, comforted, articles to be written, newsletters, magazines, books setting out the ideas and insights you gain, travel to many countries. True, there will be a cost. At times it will seem you lose everything you most wish to keep, but be assured, all shall be well, all manner of thing shall be well. You've fulfilled your life's work, Tom. We've come to say farewell, to say how much we valued your courage, honesty, creativity, humour, compassion, wisdom, your humanity. You were a very special man.
I have penned a poem. My mother would call it a poem, if she's alive. It's called To My Dad. To my dad, who loved my mother and gave me life. To my dad, who held me in his arms and rocked me to sleep. To my dad, who took me to join the local school rugby team and birthed a passion for the game within my heart. To my dad, who brought me a sheath knife for my birthday and then promptly rounded the point and blunted the blade so I would not cut myself or be able to carve my initials in the tree. To my dad, who took me swimming and eeling in the local river. To my dad, who made me a catapult that allowed me to shoot stones at the boys up the street. To my dad, who played marbles with us during marble season and always gave back the ones he won. To my dad, who caught me smoking under the local bridge. To my dad, who made me rebuild the boy up the road's fort that I wrecked when they were away on holiday. To my dad, who gave me half a crown for actually reading a book rather than a comic. To my dad, who filled me with pride at his World War II service in the Fleet Air Arm. To my dad, who told us stories about the exploits of Frank and James while we dried the dishes. To my dad, who played and wrestled with us on the lounge floor. To my dad, who shocked me by coming all the way to a Bible class camp, waving yet another dismal school report and telling me it was time to pull my finger out. To my dad, who built me a study in the garage and said I could now smoke at home. Out there. To my dad, who beamed with pride at my Teachers College graduation ceremony. To my dad, who travelled with me to London and showed me the sights he visited as a young sailor, and told me how he had hidden under a stairwell during an air raid, while the old lady he was billeted with went about her chores as if nothing was happening. To my dad, who married me to my lovely wife, and also fell in love with her. To my dad, who dedicated my children to the Lord. To my dad, who travelled overseas teaching and came back with dolls from the countries he visited to give to his granddaughters, and French perfumes for my wife. To my dad, who would on the spur of the moment buy flowers for my wife, putting me to shame. To my dad, who liked to buy me clothes, including the suit I'm now wearing. To my dad, who accepted me as I am and loved me unconditionally. To my dad, whose spiritual wisdom was second to none. To my dad, who gave, and gave again. I love you. I honour you. I miss you. You ran a good race. You fought a good fight. You have now entered the joy of the Lord, which you so richly deserve.
Family, so it's fitting, I suppose, that I should speak last. You've heard Philip, my eldest brother, speak of his, or of Dad's many and varied achievements, and Marjorie and Mark recount their personal memories of Dad. You've heard Gabriella speak of her few precious years with Tom. And Gabby, I'd like to pay you tribute for the immense tenderness and care you showed Dad over those months of his sickness. It was very moving and touching. I want to pay a tribute to my dad by reflecting for a moment on his qualities as a Christian and as a Christian leader, because above all else, Dad was a follower of Christ. I recently read a book which argued that the primary calling of Christian communities is to embody Scripture, not just to discern what Scripture means, but to live it out in practice, to incarnate it, to perform Scripture in life. And in fulfilling this communal vocation, the book stressed the importance of individual character formation, of individual believers being conformed to the image of Christ. And it suggested that the best way for this to happen is for us to follow the example of the saints in our midst. I believe that Dad was such a saint, not in the sense that he didn't have faults or weaknesses. What child could ever say that about their parents? But in the sense that he was a mature, a wise, and a faithful servant of God, whose knowledge of God and whose unwavering devotion to God was a source of strength and inspiration to others. And it was a source of strength and inspiration not just to people in this church or even to people in this country, but to people all around the world. In fact, I think in his latter years, Dad was perhaps even better known overseas than he was in New Zealand, from his speaking, from his tapes, and from his books. And one of the very many moving things of these past few months has been hearing again of the tremendous respect and affection that people had for him all over the globe. Now, why was this? What was it about Tom Marshall that called forth such respect and affection? What was it about him that I, both as his son and as a fellow follower of Jesus, admired most? Let me just mention a few things that stand out for me. The first, of course, was his deep devotion to God. I can think of no other person who has modelled for me such single-hearted, unflinching commitment to God. And it was never, ever, ever a cold, formal, legalistic commitment. There was never a trace of stuffy religiosity about Dad. He loved God. And he loved God so genuinely, so fervently, that his greatest delight in life was to know God and to communicate God to others. I often marveled, Gabby has mentioned this as well, I often marveled at the consistency of his devotion. My love for God seems to fluctuate. Sometimes it burns intensely, at other times it flickers very dimly. But it didn't seem to be that way with Dad. He never seemed to waver in his passion for God. It burned intensely and it seemed to grow stronger over time. And this is another thing, or leads to another thing about him that I appreciated so much. And I think perhaps the thing that will stand out most in my memory of him Dad never stopped growing. He never stopped developing. In fact, I think it was true of both Mum and Dad. In a very real sense, they both seemed to get younger as they got older. The normal thing for people as they age, and perhaps some people age earlier than others, but the normal thing for people is to become set in their ways, to like things to stay the same, to settle down in the security of the familiar and leave the latest enthusiasms for other younger, more energetic people. But not so with Tom Marshall. He was always enthusiastic about something, some new perspective or some new task. He was a visionary. He was constantly moving forward, and he had the most phenomenal stamina and energy to do so. He had a tremendous capacity for hard work, tremendous capacity to sleep as well. He slept so well that he could work so much harder. He always remained flexible in his outlook. He was always open to new insights. He loved to learn, he loved to read, he loved to find new ways of explaining familiar truths. And that's what it was about his teaching that was always so vibrant and creative. You never felt with Dad that he was simply recycling old, tired ideas from the past. He was caught up in a kind of permanent growth spurt. He just kept on growing wiser and growing younger all the time. I think that's why so many people have expressed shock at his death. So many have said that his death seems untimely, that it seems premature despite his 72 years today of age. Why is that? Because he seemed to have so much more to give. He seemed to have so much more to offer. He was still learning, he was still growing, and he was still traveling the world sharing the fruits of that growth. And he was sickeningly well equipped to do so. God had given to Dad a quite remarkable communication gift. I'm also in the communication business myself. I'm a theological teacher by profession. And as I struggle to articulate the Christian faith to others, I often envy the facility and sheer power with which my old man could do it. When Dad spoke, people always listened, and they were nearly always changed by what they heard. And that wasn't just because he had a good homiletical technique. Dad was so effective as a communicator, both as a preacher and a writer, because he lived and breathed what he taught. He embodied it. He didn't just teach good theory, he imparted to others his own living and latest experience of what God meant in his life. And he did so with a passion and a clarity and an integrity that breathed the very presence of God. And I think it's this that explains his extraordinary impact on people. It's not just that he was a powerful orator. It's not just that he was a brilliant writer. It's not just that he was a creative thinker, though he was all those things. Dad affected people primarily because he gave himself to them. He shared his heart and his life and his weaknesses with people, not just his head. And what he shared was good and true and loving. That's what makes me most proud of him. And that's what I will miss most about him. He was a loving man. I think that's the highest praise I could give to him. He was a man who loved. He loved God. He loved people. He loved especially bringing people into the love of God. He was never judgmental or arrogant or unkind. He repented of unkind thoughts that I would have thought were really quite kind. He was a gracious man. He was a compassionate man. He's somebody who always had time to bring the goodness of God to others. And in all this, he was, of course, like his master. He was like Jesus. And I want to be like Jesus too. And I only pray, Dad, that I will have the courage and the commitment and the discipline to become half the servant of Christ that you were.